So I'm here with Max Razdow. He's an artist, works with various mediums, including text at some points, and he recently did a residency called All Possible Pathways, in which he wrote this story, Neverborn, with this branching story structure. And it was also one thing I was interested in is that it was just written through Mastodon, which is a sort of alternative social media service. And so I'm here to talk to him about the project and his ideas about writing for screens and reading on screens and the future of literature and so on. And so I guess to get started, can you tell me just basically about the All Possible Pathways and Neverborn, how this sort of specific story emerged out of this residency and what's going on there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's fun to talk about this. So the residency was a collaboration between myself, another artist named Jamie Ziegelbaum, and then my brother Ollie, who is doing some coding and development in support of the project. So we got this grant from ThoughtWorks Arts, which is a kind of incubator program that's sort of located in a lot of cities, but this one was in their San Francisco branch. And yeah, essentially, this was kind of following up on another project that me and Jamie, my friend, had done a few years ago, where we had sort of started surreptitiously writing this science fiction story on Twitter. And we didn't really mean to do it. He just kind of like tweeted out something very random one day, and it was a very abstract statement. And I kind of followed up and tweeted the next part, and we'd never really talked about it, or eventually we talked about what we were doing. We were like, this is cool, it's interesting, but we never talked about what the story was about. And over a period of about 2 years on and off, sort of working up this piece of writing on Twitter, we completed this very strange novella, which was, for us, it was a really radical experience. It was really, really exciting. I think for most people, it was really impenetrable. But it was a strange divergence of experience, I think, where we really understood very deeply what was going on in one way or another. Like we each had our own version of what was going on, but they overlapped in a lot of strange ways, a lot of synchronicities and surreptitious kind of mutual understandings about things that were pretty arcane. So for this residency, we proposed to basically do it again. And we wanted to be a little bit more forthright about sort of like dealing with the singularity and dealing with AI, because that was kind of the premise of the residency. It's through this tech incubator, and they wanted to investigate these concepts with their artists. So we had a little bit more forethought on it. And then we essentially just wanted to go into the process the same way, go in blind, really not talk about the plot or the ideas beforehand. But we did sort of like uh, provide ourselves a foundation of this kind of specific timeline and these various acts that we wanted to go through. So just that there was a timeline involved of about 6 months, and every 2 months there was going to be a new act was going to be started. So we had this kind of dramatic kind of presentation that we wanted to deal with. But beyond that, we just let ourselves kind of go. And yeah, it was a really interesting experience. And again, I think even more so than the first time we did it, it really opened up this world building ethos that became very deeply layered and really far reaching. And our goal, our sort of impossible goal of envisioning the singularity, like we felt like we actually like broke through to some kind of new understanding, at least for ourselves in the work.
Oh, it's very interesting. And so, but you mentioned that you did a previous thing on Twitter, though, right? And
Yeah.
so with this, you used Mastodon, and there's sort of artifacts of that on the page itself, where you see the post ID numbers and timestamps, and so you're going back and forth with these sort of short form posts, and you see like who posted it, and then they all have like at Z at Max at the top,
Mhm.
and and so that's the sort of part of a structure of that. Is there a reason you switched to the sort of other platform?
Yeah, I mean, it was a prompt and a good one from the individuals at ThoughtWorks that we were working with. They felt like, Twitter has a lot of baggage. Like maybe it would be interesting to investigate this kind of more distributed mechanism of Mastodon, which doesn't have a centralized server. It has a little bit more kind of you can kind of generate your own like frameworks about it, like how many characters you want. You're not limited to Twitter's 142 characters, whatever it is. And so it was a good idea, and it also allowed us to kind of feel like we had a kind of like our own special place for it. Like rather than it being out in the open and being about like interacting with people in the process of doing this, it was a quite quiet experience. We kind of created our own server, and like it was really just us and a few bystanders from the program there, kind of like checking out what was going on. So we sort of retained like the tech stack that was really useful to us and that we had gotten used to writing in, but we were able to yeah, manage it in a different way. And another thing that was interesting about that, which we didn't foresee, was that for some reason the threading system of Mastodon was very different. So when we started writing this thing, we expected that we were going to have a pretty linear experience, like we had on Twitter, where essentially one tweet follows the next. If we tweet twice, the next one just follows that, and we had like one sort of like thread. But instead on Mastodon, for some reason, it didn't work like that. And we, anytime one of us tweeted twice to a tweet, or to a toot rather, they're called toots in Mastodon, it would fracture the story into these like parallel arcs. So instead of dealing with one storyline, we were dealing with several parallel storylines, and we would kind of, sort of like keep going on them or end them or just coin a new one whenever we wanted to. So we got this strange tree-like structure of parallel stories, which really ended up driving the process into really interesting directions.
There's a lot to respond to there. Two starting questions. One is so you set the limits, and so what did you set it to exactly? And also
I think it was
the
500 characters.
okay,
Yeah.
and so you decided on that early on, and so it could be like way longer, way shorter.
I think that there's some limits, but yeah, you can definitely like decide what your character limits are, and maybe that was the default. Maybe we just went with the default. I can't really remember why we chose that.
And then so there was occasionally there were posts that were labeled as from someone other than the two of you, and so is that someone else in the incubator, or what is that?
No, that was actually, I mean, I think there was a couple of times when a friend would pop in and maybe toot something, which I think we by and large didn't really include in the story because simultaneously my brother was developing this application that kind of parsed out the data and put it into a more readable format. But yeah, at the same time, we did end up kind of creating these like simulated characters within there, I guess you could call them. Like we were each narrators, like myself, Max, and Jamie were narrators, and we had our own accounts. But then at some point, Jamie created an account for a sort of like character within the story, which was called Himroy Himhimini, who is a dictionary essentially, or an encyclopedia, that kind of like had all this knowledge about the world that we were building. And so sometimes he would tweet from the voice of Himroy Himhimini, and then I created a counter encyclopedia that had a very different ontology and worldview called Our Hour, which was written by Velus Abamini, who ends up being an antagonist in the story. So yeah, we created a few other accounts and played around with that. I think that Jamie also created an account for the main character Lou at one point, and she kind of tried to break the fourth wall and like interact with us as writers. But yeah, these were definitely like the bulk of it was just Jamie and I tweeting in our own narrator voice.
And so the branching structure was like sort of unplanned, accidental bit, just because you were working on this medium.
At first it was, yeah. At first we, it could be very confusing, and sometimes one of us would decide to do two toots to respond to a thought for one reason or another. And at first we didn't realize that that was going to fracture the story. But then once we realized what was going on, it became like a mechanism of our writing process. So we were, consciously coining new story arcs and, having, the character kind of like inhabit these different spaces within the tale, that were parallel and would interact with each other conceptually. And later on, we got really fancy with it, and we got my brother to create like a portaling structure so that we could tie branches back together. Not, you can't really see it if you're looking at Mastodon itself, but in the kind of parser reader program that he created, there's ways that you can jump from one thread to another. So the end of the story ended up being a process of kind of tying many of these threads back together, as though like these multiple dimensions were kind of coming back into conversation with each other.
Right. And so I was interested in also this broader idea of collaboration, right? Because obviously, one of the things, whether it's Twitter or Mastodon or, anything, is you're connecting with people across sort of vast distances. And I think, for instance, like you have early on William Gibson and Bruce Sterling write the difference engine where they're mailing floppy disks back together. but like, these networks we have now are like, so much more convenient, and you're interacting with people like constantly. And so I was, interested in your experience with that. And also one thing that seemed to happen from that is, some toots, I guess you said they're called, were
Yeah.
self-contained, and then, the next thing sort of just follows up with the story. But then also you started uh, leaving things sort of hanging mid-sentence, and then the next person is sort of tasked with like following from
Hmm.
that somehow. And in some cases that ended up with sort of humorous things. So at one point you wrote Ted's drool was drawing on his, and then that was the end. And then the follow-up was Ted's drool was drawing on his slightly smaller version of himself that he kept under his chin for emergencies. And so I was wondering, to what extent that sort of playfulness is, the tone that you were seeking from the start, or to what extent that sort of just emerges out of this idea of like you're collaborating on this network, and that's sort of what that medium sort of produces.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different reasons that that kind of, I'll answer the second part first. There's a few different reasons that that kind of like writing style became useful and became kind of, our companion in this process. It's kind of gonzo, like humorous, sort of surrealism. And I think that one of them is just about the material that we wanted to deal with. I mean, we're both science fiction buffs, and we had given ourselves this goal of this post-singularity, this post-human kind of universe where things are so radically disjointed, in the process of this kind of like high end of the parabolic arc toward something completely inconceivable, that we gave ourselves that license to kind of be like, well, individuals are not really individuals. They're maybe parts of a shard of a artificial intelligence, or they're, they kind of can shapeshift, and they can, manipulate their own bodies in very strange ways. And what is their body anyway? And what is the ground that they're standing on? Is this constant sort of like desire to question, what things might be. And the other side of it is just because we didn't know what we were doing, we or each other were doing. So, Jamie would write something that I kind of didn't really understand, and he might understand it very well in his own head. And the only way to really deal with it would be to just like have a sense of humor about it, and kind of like chase down the next kind of poetic image that might arise at the tip of your mind. And then the last thing that really did that helped that, I think, was just the framework of Mastodon itself. This Twitter like little shard of text that you got, where you would get this set number of characters, and you would really want to evoke a lot in that. You would want to deal with the last person's thought process. You'd want to push it to something new. Often there was some plot point in my mind that I really wanted to try to get us to, and it was always a struggle to get there because Jamie might spin it off in some other direction. So, it was like each word was really precious, and it made this sort of like deep, very sort of fractured but very dense imagistic substrate like the way to do it, like just the best way to like get the most into that little moment that you had before it was the next person's turn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and leading into like, I guess, some of the wider ideas about like the future of literature and like reading and writing for screens, though, I'm curious because this, I think, works really well within the way you're describing, where it's this, heavily science fiction story about these sort of post-human entities, in these sort of quantum realities that have these sort of split timelines, and they sort of are aware of this in some ways at times, and such. But to what extent do you think this, maybe not this exact structure, but this sort of writing approach, might apply to something that's like not so deeply science fictional, post singularity kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I think it's got like tendrils to the past. I mean, it's not so different in some ways to the way that the Beats would write, right? Or the way that like kind of gonzo fiction writers would write, like Vonnegut and, Kotzwinkle and stuff like that, or Jeff Noon, a more contemporary kind of cyberpunk version of that. So, I think it's a continuum of something. I wouldn't really be able to label what it is, but something that's happening in our mental space or our cultural space that kind of drives an interest, an ongoing interest in this kind of language formation. But beyond that, I think that, looking toward the future more, when we were talking about what this was really for, it was really clear to us that like reading it like a book was possible, but it wasn't really its like ultimate manifestation, but rather that this was sort of a world building exercise that was kind of not necessarily about plot and character development and linear time spaces as much as it was about the coining of this very deep unflowering of some kind of like alternate universe. And I think that it's maybe like its manifestation also has some kinship to things that are not literary at all, that are more about like cultural directions towards like world building for game design or world building for just like virtual reality in general. And some kind of, if we are tending towards some kind of very vastly new digital future, maybe this kind of process is a way for collectives of people to unlock the potential of that kind of form manifesting.
Right, and you do a lot of visual art, and you've done some like poems with visuals and things like that. That maybe is a little slower and more involved than sort of lends itself to this intense back and forth collaborative work.
Mhm.
Um, but have you having done this sort of gone back and thought about like rather than just like here's like these little dots on like branches, but like what would the sort of vast visual panorama look like? Or
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's sort of like in my own work, it definitely leaches out into the work a little bit. And the stuff that grabs me visually is kind of cosmological. The idea of multiple levels and this kind of very slippery substrate that we would often talk about, like that everything is kind of porous. Things are made out of these made up materials like the mesh and the shale that allow people to slip in and out of these different levels of kind of sort of like consciousness materiality, right, or something, or maybe like techno future building, right, where so definitely like I feel like there are visual elements that have slipped back into my work a lot, and some of them were kind of there beforehand, I think, too, and they just found a way to speak through this project and become more realized and easier for me to grapple with. But yeah, absolutely.
well, also, I mean, going back to something I mentioned briefly earlier, but in terms of like the visual presentation of this, you have these artifacts of the platform, with the username and timestamp, ID number, and then most strikingly is that at the beginning of each passage, it's at max or at z where you're responding to the previous thing, and so that's sort of left in there. Um, is there a reason you thought like that would be like useful to like keep all of that in there and not sort of just streamline it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is about like a trace to the archival, essence of its creation, because the experience of that application in its current state is one where I think the right way to experience it is to like listen to it, because it has a text to speech, aspect. So you can kind of like start it at some place on the tree at the beginning or in the middle or whatever thread you want to check out, and you can just sit back and listen to it being spoken to you. But then if you want to read it and you want to get in there closer, I think we did decide that it was just nice to leave a breadcrumb of like who had authored what thought. In a way, it's as much as it's like a piece of some kind of gonzo far out literature. It's also like it is like a record of its own creation a bit. So yeah.
Right, and so the text to speech that's in Mastodon, or
That's part of the application that my brother Ollie built. So he yeah, we had done this previously for our last work on a more sort of ad hoc experimental basis to just display it at one point. And so he went back and he made a more refined version for this new book. And yeah, so the text to speech is not coming from Mastodon. The program parses out the data from Mastodon and puts it into like an array that captures its form, its tree structure. And then you can choose a spot within the tree and walk through the branches. And as you walk through it, the text to speech application will read it to you. And there's
yeah.
actually more features planned, but it's been a long time kind of cobbling them together. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're trying to do with it, like visual elements and things like that.
More features for the same story or for future projects?
Well, it's for the same story, although, it could be used for other stories. Like if somebody else wrote a story on Mastodon in the same way and, wanted to integrate it, it would be really easy to kind of like point to their Mastodon server and capture it the same way that we did ours, parse it and create a tree for people to walk through.
Oh, that's actually really cool. Yeah, so the goal in part is to sort of craft this sort of form around Mastodon as a sort of writing medium. medium, and then and so do you think about that at all as you're working through your own story about like how adaptable this is sort of universally or semi-universally?
We've thought about it. I mean, I feel like, experimental writing is a very personal sort of process, and our process may or may not work for other people's processes. But we've definitely thought about the utility for things that are naturally occurring in spaces like that, like kind of like fan forums where people might be writing like a fan fiction for a video game that they're invested in or something, and there's this process of like mutual authorship. If this tool was something that was available to people, I think it might kind of quicken that process and give it a presentation that would maybe enhance people's interest in writing collaboratively in this manner.
And so there any other platforms that aren't widely used now that you think might be interesting to explore for writing or reading sort of creatively?
I'm not really sure. I mean, this was like this has been a very like kind of specific investigation for me in my practice, and I think for Jamie too. Like, I know there's lots of interesting mediums out there where kind of interpersonal communication is happening and writing is happening. But I think that there needs to be a leap for this kind of creation to happen, like a leap of faith by the people involved that are like, yeah, we want to make something crazy and we want to leave behind our individual selves to some extent. Like when Jamie and I did this, or when anybody does this, really what you're doing is you're giving up, your personal authorship in favor of something being created, like a third voice is kind of coming into the picture and kind of creating it for you. So, I'm not sure there's any platforms that lend themselves to that too readily. It would be cool to see that kind of become something that's out there. Like, most of the platforms that are out there are about, sort of an individual sort of making a statement, and then other individuals either agreeing or counter or making a counter argument, and it becomes very much about, one's self manifesting something. And even though there might be this amazing discourse that's captured, it's not, the self isn't really left at the doorstep.
Right. Yeah. I think I didn't really think as much in advance about the system that's taking the information off the server and structuring it, but it's this interesting dynamic where so you could have either writing within a sort of ready-made medium, like it's a sort of Twitter story or something on Instagram or something, or you craft your own whole program where it's like I want to be able to do this and this, and you just sort of design the whole thing from the ground up for your own creative purposes.
Mm.
But this was really interesting hearing, so you have in some ways, things like the branching structure was shaped by the thing, but you're also augmenting what it offers, to give you a little more than what is there, which I think is a really interesting possibility for, I guess, reading and writing broadly. And so do you have, I mean, other than, specific platforms, do you have any sort of broader thoughts about like the future of literature, things you think might be possible or things you expect are likely for better or worse, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think literature is an interesting term because it has a history of being kind of rarefied, right? Like there's to write a book is this thing that is a rarefied process that takes a long time and has a sort of like particular market direction. And I think it's really important. Some of the things that have happened in there, I think, are really important to retain in general, like just the idea of like investigating human values in a really deep symbolic space, and figuring out this shifting of meaning as time passes through that process. Other things I think might not really last. Like, I don't know if the book form is something that we're going to have a great relationship with in the future. I think already, like in our lifetimes, we've seen so many different mediums coming and kind of like taking up, the novels like market share or whatever, and kind of transforming it into different spaces. So I think that the future is probably going to be something pretty different. I think that we're probably going to retain the desire to storytell, and we're going to retain the need for that as a culture. And in a way, I think it's probably even more important in the future to be really able to manage that, because now we have the machinic essence is kind of all around us, and that's something that kind of has a very different desire maybe than what humans might have. But how that gets negotiated, I think it's mysterious, but I do think that the directions do seem to point in some kind of interpersonal, process, maybe where, you know, uh, there's going, because it's become so radically horizontal and leveled, the process of writing stuff, that might be the basis for the way that the kind of story content is created and transmitted in the future. And yeah, I mean, I think that could be really powerful, and maybe an interesting way for literature to happen as things go on.
So you think a lot more collaboration in the future rather than this
Yeah,
sort of idea of like the solitary writer?
I mean, I think that I don't know. I mean, I don't think that the solitary writer's ever gonna leave or gonna go away. I mean, I think that that's just a desire that people have, to go into their cave and manifest something for themselves and for others. So no, I don't think that's going to really disappear. But I do think that collaboration has a unique human acceleration potential that is maybe going to be very useful to people. Where there's some kind of intersubjectivity that is really vital for us right now and is sort of being accelerated by our technological processes already, and that chasing that down is maybe going to be part of the equation. I like to think that, like, in the future, I mean, you were talking in your video about William Gibson and his writing the other day about the character that wants to be I think it's called a stem
Sim
cell
star simulated
stem cell,
stimulation.
right? So she's like an individual that's going in and being essentially that. She's like a one individual whose persona gets mapped out and is accessible to all these other people in this imagined virtual space. Um, that's one way to think about it. But what we're doing on social media is not necessarily that. Like, we're also all collaborating and communicating at this very rapid pace. And I wonder if we could create our own kind of almost like tulpas, right? Like some kind of imaginational manifestation that gets pulled out of that space and kind of arises and becomes a kind of like experiential character that can just sort of germinate across this vector, not because one person embodied it or created it, but just because it's sort of like persona just arised out of this collective will.
Right. And so this current project is very much this, distinct experimental work. But so in terms of thinking about like what we do on social media broadly, do you think over time that like distinction might blur a bit, where like there'll be, there's more of a sense of, either solo or collaborative writing projects within these platforms that like bleed into general use, and then it's like, but it's all sort of the same, or
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. I think it's already sort of happening, right? I mean, when you look at like meme culture or something, right, that kind of arises out of individuals that are spending a lot of time online communicating through these platforms. That's like a very low level version of it, right? Like, there is a literature being developed there. There's like this sort of pantheon of characters and variations of those characters, and those characters are kind of dialoguing in their own sort of wild comic strip, right? That's dealing with a lot of social, content effectively, I think. And what's a future step from that is that maybe those characters, if I was William Gibson writing a novel about this, like, maybe I would be saying, oh, like, maybe some of those characters just sort of attain their own life. Like, some AI understands exactly what their context is and breathes them into some kind of like living entity in a virtual space that can communicate with us. And who authored that? Like, nobody authored it. We all kind of authored it, or a vast number of people authored it. So, I feel like the tool that me and Jamie made up to do this art piece, if there was 1,000 people communicating on there and just deciding that they wanted to write some crazy fiction together, they would probably do the same thing. They would have characters that would reoccur. They'd develop new characters. Some of them would be ignored and die off. Other ones would become really popular and develop. And it would not be that different than what we see happening, through just like memes, in social media at large.
right. Although one thing that, and I think this is part of the augmenting structure of the story, but this ability to scroll not just up and down as we normally do on a lot of these platforms, but like the side to side, and the way it has these branches and there's parallels and such. I think it really gives this interesting literal added dimension to it. It'd be interesting to see, what something like that might look like in a more general use. That's not just for like sci-fi story or something,
Right.
but like the way there are these sort of parallels, already in within our communication that like we don't necessarily have the ready-made tools to just like, oh, let me jump sideways from here, even though conceptually, you could imagine a lot of things that would be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of happens through tagging sometimes, right? Like if somebody might be having a long thread about like, how to groom dogs or something, and then someone throws a hashtag in there, and all of a sudden it links to a totally different conversation that happens to have that one word. So like the infrastructure is there kind of to do it, but yeah, I'm not sure how meaningful it is all the time, right? Whereas like in a more condensed format, maybe with some vast AI really looking at it or something, you could like generate a lot of meaning from leaping from conversation to conversation.
Right, right. Um, so I was really interested in hearing about the story and so wider ideas. Is there anything in particular you wanted to add on to this, or?
No, I mean, well, I would say that the story is there for anybody to read. I can send you a link to post up or whatnot. There's so many themes in it that like picking one out to like talk about would be, really, really, I wouldn't be able to identify which one there was, would be the best one to talk about. But um, I mean, I think that if I was going to leave like one little nugget out of the text, maybe one of my favorite parts is this idea about the Star-Kissed prophecy, which was a kind of minor thread, sort of developed this concept, and it ended up kind of stretching out towards the end of the story and defining a lot of the way that the ending kind of manifested. And the idea of the prophecy was that at one point, a splinter sect of these like very powerful AI beings that were able to kind of manipulate reality was able to kind of somehow summon humans, which had by and large were thought to be gone. This is a sort of post-human space for the most part. And the human came back and was kind of like became a revenant form, and all of a sudden there was a human in this kind of post-singularity space, and he only lasted for like a second. Like he coughed and he like took off his hat and he said one thing, and that thing was a notion, which I'm not going to be able to remember verbatim, but it was a notion about being very careful about not losing the ability to create art. And at the end of the story, that becomes a really important vector. And I think that maybe to some degree, what art is in a post-singularity, post-human future is very questionable. But that somehow, that's always driven a lot of the way that I think about AI and about like what our real mission is in being humans right now at a time when, it's very clear that something is already starting to bubble up that's non-human and has a lot of buoyancy and power in our space, is that there's certain things that it can't do, and that it's really important to retain the ability to do those things.
Right, yeah, definitely a lot of value in storytelling, and interesting to see what that looks like on that vast time scale, but also in the sort of immediate sense, in terms of reading and writing for screens. Definitely recommend people look over Neverborn, and at least briefly play around with like the scrolling around and seeing how ideas develop and follow up, and the sort of possibilities there. And thank you for coming in and talking about all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It was really a pleasure. Looking forward to hearing the rest of your podcast.